Hello, and thank you for joining me for this presentation on creating accessible and usable courses, resources, and strategies for success. What I'm going to go over is some basics about Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, also known as WCAG, and how you can make your courses easier to access and use for your students. So a little bit about myself. My name is Max Tran. I'm a member of the Learning Support and Development team here at the Division of Academic Innovation. I've been here for almost 2 years now, and I've also been on the accessibility and usability team that we have in the division for about a year or so now. And I wanted to start off with a quote: "Accessibility is not a problem to be solved, it is a culture to be built." And this is something that I think is very important to take into account because the need for accessibility is not going to go away. And also, when you view something as a problem, typically it's viewed as something that's negative. And accessibility isn't negative, it benefits everybody. And so I think it's important for us to, build a culture around it. It's not something that's going away, it's something that's beneficial to people. And so I think this quote is very important. But first, I want to give you a little bit of a differentiation between accessibility and usability before we continue. So accessibility is the ability of people to access and benefit from a product or service regardless of their abilities or circumstances. And usability is how easy it is for a user to accomplish their goals when using a service. So typically, something we think of when we think of accessibility and usability is captions on videos. And, when we think of that as well, we also think of somebody who's hard of hearing, somebody who's deaf, who needs those captions in order to understand what's going on. Well, we don't always think about, the student, the person who just wants to view that video, but they don't have headphones. They're out in public. They're on the train somewhere. In a Uber, who knows, and they want to watch this video. Well, if they don't have headphones, we typically tend to see it as rude to not have your headphones in. They have to play it out loud. But if the video had captions, they wouldn't necessarily need to do that. And so that's an example of something, we typically think of it one way, but that's not always the case. And usability, again, of course, these are important things because we want our students to focus more on learning and less on having to figure out how to navigate their classes. If I'm having to spend a bunch of time, trying to find my assignments, try to figure out, how do I do this assignment? Where is all this stuff located? All this information that I need. If I have to do that on top of actually completing the assignment, on top of actually reading the material or doing this activity, I'm going to be less susceptible to actually doing the work and retaining that information because I'm already frustrated that it took me so long to find all of this in the first place. So instead of taking away from their learning time, we want to make it as easy as possible for our students. And so I'm going to start going over some of the basics, and one of the biggest ones is text and hyperlinks. So for this first bullet point, if you look at this slide, you have the title, which is bold and bigger font, and then you have the body, which is smaller font and not bolded. And so this goes into using the proper heading structure. And what this means is, visually, this makes it a lot easier to see what's going on in this slide. What's the title? What am I reading off of? But say you're not able to do that. Say you're using a screen reader. If you use the proper heading structure, a screen reader is going to signify what the heading structure is, what each type of font is, or not each type of font, but what each, heading structure is, and the student who's using the screen reader is going to be able to properly determine, what's a title, what's this, what's that. So it'll be easier for them to understand. You also want to use bold and italics sparingly for emphasis. And what I mean by this is it's okay to have it in like a couple words. Typically we say to use bold over italics, but say you have a student who is dyslexic. They have a hard time reading already as is, and then you put something like a whole paragraph that's a side note in italics. They are now going to struggle even more to read that text, or they may not even be able to read it. And so it just makes it more difficult for students to understand. Third, you want to ensure there's adequate color contrast. And an example of this is the slide. I have light font, dark background. But of course, say you have, you're trying to highlight something. If I were to highlight this font yellow, it would probably be very difficult to read. And if I have to spend time trying to pick out the letters and the words against this background that didn't need to be that color, I'm going to get pretty frustrated. But take into account, what if you have a student who is colorblind and they're now unable to see that there's even any text in that area, that section that's highlighted? They're not going to be able to retain that information. They don't know that information is there. And finally, you want to make sure your hyperlink text is descriptive, meaningful, and consistent. And what I mean by that is, instead of posting the entire link, just the URL, https://youtube.com. That's fine, but if you have a student who's using a screen reader, or even especially a longer URL, that screen reader is going to read every single character in that URL. And that student is going to have to sit there and listen to it read that URL in full before it can continue to the rest of the information on the page. Well, not only does it inconvenience that student, but it also doesn't look very good on your page. So instead of doing that, you would put something like, please navigate to the YouTube homepage to watch XYZ video. And YouTube homepage is what your hyperlink would be. A screen reader reading that would say link YouTube homepage and continue to the rest of the sentence or the rest of the content on that page. Whereas if it were the hyperlink, it would be please navigate to link https://, but it typically does it slower, and read that whole thing and then continue to the content. So that's an example of how you would want your hyperlinks. Moving on to images. One of the biggest things with images is, of course, the alt text or alternative text, which is what shows up when that image is not able to be shown. For example, the link breaks. It's happened before, and so there will be a little description there. Best practice is you want it to be 120 characters or less, and I think a tweet was 140, but say it in a tweet, if you know what I mean. You want to make sure that your student, even if it's just reading it because they're able to see it and the image was broken, you want to make sure that they're not sitting there forever trying to decipher what's going on with this image. But again, if a student's using a screen reader, it's going to read that entire thing of alt text before it moves on to something else. So if you have a huge description of what this image is, that student's going to be sitting there stuck on that image for longer than they should be. And in my mind, the way I see this is, how much information are you actually getting from this image? You want to think of, if you look at this image, does it need a bigger description? Is this a complex diagram that I'm going to have to explain, further on? Or is this something that is just like, okay, I'm able to understand what this is by looking at it for a couple seconds, that's all. That's what you want to convey in your alt text and why you want it to be so brief. Next bullet point about alt text, you want to make sure it matches the context of the image. So different courses, of course, we have all sorts of different courses here, will have different contexts to them. So say I have an image of an airplane over a runway and it's sunset. For an aviation class, you might say something like a Boeing 737 centered over the runway as it lands. That's a specific plane type. It's more specific than a photography class, say. It has different information. And for a photography class, you might go, put alt text that says a head-on photograph of a plane landing composed using 1-point perspective, contrast, and emphasis. Now, I'm not a photography major. I have no idea what any of that means, but obviously that's very different information than what you would see in an aviation class. Another one, and this kind of goes against the last example that I gave, but given the context of the class, that made sense. You want to make sure your alt text doesn't start with image of or graphic of. Why? So, say that image is broken. Somebody is looking at that image and they're reading the alt text. They know it's an image. They know what it was. There's a little thumbnail, there's a little box around where it would be. You can tell that it was supposed to be an image. But for a screen reader, it's going to signify already that the student is looking at an image. So using image of or graphic of takes away from the characters you could be using to actually describe what's going on in the picture. And finally, you want to make sure your images are not used as links. And again, a screen reader is going to signify that that is an image. So if you make it a link, it can make it a little bit confusing, but also if you aren't explaining ahead of time that that image is a link, students may not know that that's what that is. They may not know to click that, to go somewhere. It may be a little bit confusing. So while it is not best practice to use images as links, if you are going to use an image as a link, please make sure that you are describing what that is, and that's something that you would also do in the alt text. Moving on to audio and video, you want to make sure any media that you have in your course contains synchronized captions with punctuation. Again, people who are hard of hearing, somebody who doesn't have access to headphones, that's important. Audio-only sources should have a text transcript, same as the above. Somebody who, I personally prefer to listen and read because I'm able to retain my information better that way. So this may also be just preferences for the students. This may be helping them learn easier as opposed to just they can't hear. You want to make sure your audio is high quality. And again, if my audio is not high quality, if I'm having to sit here and try to decipher what somebody's saying, it's going to be a lot harder for me to learn what I'm supposed to learn because I'm so focused on trying to understand what's being said. And finally, you want to make sure your transcripts have correct punctuation. I'm sure we've all tried to read a paper, an article, something that just has really bad punctuation, and it can be hard to follow along, even, just reading it ourselves. But if a student who has a screen reader, and screen readers work, try to act as human as possible. So they'll read in a tone based on punctuation and context around what's happening. And so if those transcripts don't have correct punctuation, those screen readers are not going to be able to use the correct tone, and it might be a little bit confusing for the students. And finally, as far as content goes, we're going to talk about some charts and tables. And so these are things that typically show up a lot, and I am a STEM major, so I'm going to use STEM courses as an example. But you want to make sure your charts and graphs have titles, labels, and a description. Now, being a STEM major, I know this by heart. I've followed this forever because I have been marked off points for not having titles, labels, and a description. And this is just information that tells your reader or the student, this is what this chart is, this is what the axes are, or this is what the rows are, and this is what we use this for. It's just a lot easier in helping your student understand what's going on, because sometimes these things can get pretty complex. You also want to make sure for a table, your row and column headers are indicated as such. This is typically done by, in Excel. You can make a table header. It'll use a special, not font, but coloration to differentiate and stuff. You also want to make sure no empty or merged cells are in the tables. The reason for this is, again, I'm using screen reader a lot, but say I'm using a screen reader, and a lot of screen readers use the arrow keys for navigation, and if you're reading information in a table, you have to go through each individual cell. And so if there's empty or merged cells, it can be confusing for the student because they don't understand, oh, am I at the end of the content? Is this whatever? Or it may not read properly. And finally, you want to make sure your elements are differentiated using something other than color. Sometimes the colors, I've personally had to do this in MATLAB where I had too many lines and some of them were the same color and it got really confusing. And so in order to differentiate that, you want to add a symbol or something like that. MATLAB does have that ability to add symbols or shapes to your lines so that you're able to see that instead. And again, even aside from that, if somebody is colorblind, they may not be able to differentiate those colors to see, oh, this is a hydrogen line, this is a helium line, because they may be too close in color. And finally, I'm going to move on to some of the resources that are available for you. In Canvas, there is a drop-down in the Rich Content Editor. Currently, it shows paragraph because that's the font type that I had selected. But that shows you the heading levels that I talked about earlier. And obviously, heading level 2 is larger. You have heading level 3, 4, and then paragraph, or your body font is what it will be called if you're using something like Word. But that is a way for you to use the proper heading structure. And this too, I know Canvas in the Rich Content Editor does have an option at the bottom for you to switch to the HTML. If you're not tech savvy, you're not going to know anything about that. But this will help you ensure that the students are able to, or that your content has the correct heading structure. Something else that's really cool that Canvas has is the Canvas Accessibility Checker. And what this is a little icon down in the bottom. When you're filling out the Rich Content Editor with your content and you say miss some alt text, this little guy is going to have a notification that pops up to show you, hey, we noticed that there's something that's maybe not accessible. You should check this out. And so if you click on that icon, it's going to open a little flyout to the side called the Accessibility Checker, and it'll show you exactly where it's caught that that item that may not be accessible, and you'll be able to change it directly in the Accessibility Checker. So in this example, I have an alt text file or a image that doesn't have alt text, but if I were to, use, say my contrast isn't good enough for my font, this will also pop up and you'll be able to change the color of your font in the Accessibility Checker. And another resource that you have access to is the Digital Accessibility Resources and Tools. This can be found in Ernie, and this has a lot of information. It'll go more in depth than what I have today, but it has, how you can learn about digital accessibility, how to create accessible content, and it goes into more depth, again, more items than what I went over. I went over basics, but this has everything you'll need, and it also has videos, tips, and tools that you can watch and look at as well. And these are just some beneficial resources that I've found, and I wanted to include this slide as well because it has an example of how you want to use your hyperlink text. And so I did not choose a very good, set of slides to properly show contrast between the links and the title font, but you're typically when you have a URL or a hyperlink, it's going to be underlined, so that will be helpful as well. But the first one is a color contrast checker by Accessible Web, and that parentheses at the end tells you where you're going, like what website you're going to. So a screen reader would read link color contrast checker Accessible Web. And so you click that link, it takes you to Accessible Web, but you'll be able to input hex values for colors. I think it may even have an eyedropper tool, so you can use that as well. But it's a good way to make sure you have good contrast in your content. And underneath that, we have how do I add auto-generated captions to my media file in Canvas Studio. If you create any content videos in Canvas Studio, you will be able to automatically generate captions for that. And this is a link to the guide Canvas has that walks you through how to do that. The third link is an alt decision tree. And what that is this is more so for coding is what W3C is, but it's also a good way for, even if you're not a coder, to help you determine, do you need alt text, what should your alt text say? It's helpful for that. And then finally, I have a link to a screen reader user survey by WebAIM. They're another accessibility website, and this is a research study that they did on the most used screen readers used by, I don't remember if it was specifically students or just people in general. So if you want to try out a screen reader for yourself, typically your operating system, Mac, Windows, will have one pre-installed on your device, so you'll be able to use that one. But this goes through some of the other more popular screen readers that people use. And thank you. That is all I have for today.